Earnouts are typically used where the seller and buyer cannot agree on a final purchase price. The seller on one hand believes that the business has much greater potential than the buyer is willing to acknowledge. The buyer, seeing that there are activities which could occur in the future but are uncertain, is not willing to pay the seller a price to incorporate those into the future earnings of the business. In order to overcome this gap, what they agree is a base purchase price, which represents the stable and assured earnings of the business, and then some compensation depending on what the outcome of certain events or certain activities are. The difficulty with earnouts is it's almost impossible to predict with any great accuracy what's going to happen. And in formulating the future events and the compensation for the seller and the seller's shareholders, there is a good degree of uncertainty about how event outcomes can be measured. So, for example, if the sellers believe that they can earn much higher revenues and profits in the future, and the buyer is willing to compensate them for that over some period of time, 1, 2 or 3 years, then the question is, how do we measure revenue and how do we measure net profit? Because it's quite possible that the seller can manipulate the revenue earning figures and the profit figures through changing the timing of expenses or changing the timing of revenue recognition. The other quite important aspect of earnouts is that it requires the cooperation often of both the buyer and the seller for outcomes to be realised. If the seller is dependent on the resources from the buyer or permission from the buyer in order to achieve the outcomes built into the earnout, and the buyer fails to provide the resources necessary for those outcomes to be realised, then we have the basis of a dispute. More often than not, the best earnout processes are where neither party can influence the outcome. So there is some event in progress, such as, for example, the granting of a licence or the granting of rights or the signing of a contract by a key customer, which neither party can materially influence. And in the event that that outcome materialises, it will have a dramatic impact on the future potential of the business. If, however, the seller must get permission from the buyer for certain outcomes to be realised, and that permission doesn't occur, or that support doesn't occur, then we have the basis of a dispute. Often what we're looking for in an earnout is a situation where the seller has the majority of control over the outcome events. The buyer gives permission for the seller to work on those activities and events that will materially influence the outcome, and the seller has all the resources necessary to determine whether in fact that outcome will occur. In a situation like that, the seller has much greater control over what the outcome is likely to be. Where the buyer has a material impact on whether outcomes occur, the seller is dependent on the goodwill of the buyer. If for whatever reason the buyer is unwilling or unable to provide the resources or the authorities for the seller to achieve the events or activity outcomes necessary in the earnout, then the whole thing simply ends up in a dispute. Earnouts are feeding ground for lawyers. I would imagine that in most cases, most earnouts end up in dispute. I have been involved in 2 earnouts in selling 2 different businesses. In one particular case, the earnout ended up in court, in litigation. We got into a situation where neither the seller nor the buyer could agree on the outcome. In the second situation, the buyer changed their mind as to what they wanted the company to work on. We had finished the first stage of the earnout and we were clearly going to accomplish the next 2 stages, but the buyer wanted a different outcome. We therefore negotiated a full payout of stages 2 and 3. Stage 4, which was a revenue-based earnout, we couldn't agree on, and in the end we settled on 50% of the earnout in order to move forward. But it's quite normal for earnouts to end up in some form of disagreement, whether the buyer can't finish what they committed to do or whether the seller can't finish what they committed to do. More often than not, the earnout will end up in a dispute.